In the previous videos, we have created our library Spring Boot application and configured the logback to do the logging for us. In this application, we will implement the data access layer so we can store our books in a database. To implement the data access layer, we will use the Spring Data JPA, which is an abstraction over a JPA provider. It helps us to implement repositories to simply query data from the database. As a JPA provider, we will use Hibernate, which is the default by Spring Data. The data will be stored in H2 in-memory database, and we will use the H2 dialect for this. Instead of using the Hibernate's automatic schema creation, we will use a script-based table creation where we store the schema in the schema.sql file, and we will also store some sample data in the data.sql file. Then we will implement the book entity and the book repository, and at the end we will test that everything works by writing some tests. Now let's take a look how our book entity will look like. It will have 4 fields. The first field will be the UUID, which is a universal unique ID. This ID is unique across the whole application. Then the second field is title. It's a field of type variable characters of length 255. Then we will have the author field. It will be also a field of type variable character of 255 characters. And the last field is the ISBN, which is the International Standard Book Number. And since we know that currently the ISBNs have a maximal length of 13 digits, we can use a variable character of length 13 characters. Now let's start with the implementation. The first thing we need to do is to add dependencies. So let's open the build Gradle file and let's add the dependency on the Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. It's almost the same as the Spring Boot Starter, so I will just duplicate it and add the suffix data JPA. The second dependency we need is the dependency on the H2 database. Since we need the database only on runtime, let's add it as a runtime only dependency. There we have it. Let's load the changes. So we have the dependencies in place. Now let's configure it. Let's go to the application properties file. As mentioned, we want to do a schema creation based on scripts instead of using the automatic schema creation by Hibernate. So let's disable the automatic schema creation. We can do this by setting the spring.jpa Hibernate DDA as a data definition language, auto equal to none. With this property, we disable the Hibernate automatic schema creation. The second thing is to enable the script-based schema initialization for all databases, because by default, we can do this only for embedded databases, but we want to allow to do it in every database. We can do it by setting the Spring SQL init mode equals to always. With this property, we can create tables in any database using script. Now we need to specify the URL of the database. It will be JDBC H2 memory, and let's call the database as library. Then we need the username. Let's call it admin. Then we need the password. This username and password will be used to access the database. Now we need to configure some driver to access the database. Think data source, driver, class, name, org, h2, driver. The driver is an application which allows us to use a generic interface to connect to a vendor-specific implementation of a database. You can imagine it as a driver, for example, for a printer. Now we need to set the dialect which we will use to communicate with our database, because different databases, even though are using SQL, which is the main language, they have some small differences in their syntax. And by dialect, we can say how we want to communicate with the database. So let's set the dialect H2 dialect. Now we have the application properties in place. We can move on and create our schema script. The schema script has to be stored in the resources folder. So let's create it. This file is picked up by Spring Data and it is used to create the tables we need. Since we have only one entity, I need only one table, and let's call it books. And as mentioned, the books table will have 4 fields. The first is the UUID. The UUID is the primary key of the table. Then we have the title. It has 255 characters. The next field is the author, with 255 characters too. And the last field is the ISBN, which has only 13 characters. That is our schema.sql file. Now let's create the file for providing some sample data. We can do it by creating a data.sql file. The data.sql file will be automatically picked up by Spring, and it will be used to fill some data into the database. To make it faster, let me copy some sample data. So here we are adding a book with this UUID, title clean code, author Robert Cecil Martin, and with this ISBN. The second book has this UUID. It's called Effective Java. The author is Joshua Bloch, and it has this ISBN. So now, once we have the schema and the data, let's create the book entity. I'm going to create it within a model package. Since we are creating an entity, we need to use the entity annotation. Using this annotation, we let Spring know that this class is an entity. Then we need to say what's the table name we use for this entity. If we would not specify it, it would use the entity name, but it's slightly different because the table name is books with the suffix s. We can do it by the table annotation. And as mentioned, we have the 4 fields. And let's generate getters and setters for them. Now we have the 4 fields, and we have to say which of these fields is the ID. We can do it by the ID annotation. And the second thing is that somehow we need to set this ID. We want Spring to generate the ID for us, so we don't have to care about it. To make Spring generate the ID for us, we can use the generate value annotation by setting a strategy UUID. Now we are done with our entity. The second thing we need to implement is the repository. So let's create a package repository, and let's create the book repository in it. I want to highlight that the book repository will be an interface. This interface has to extend the JPA repository class, and we need to provide the type of entity stored within this repository and the ID we use for this entity. It's UUID in our case. Then we also need to annotate this interface using the repository annotation so it can be found by the Spring. Now we are done with our implementation. The last thing remaining is to test that everything works as we want. What better way to test something we can find than writing a test for it? So let's create a test. I want to test the book repository that it works, so I'm going to create a repository test and put it into the repository package. I have to annotate this test class with the Spring Boot test annotation, so the Spring configuration is loaded. Then I will need the book repository. Otherwise I cannot test the repository. Now we have the repository in place. We can start writing the test. The first test I want to try is that the repository is working. For this, let's create a test which will create a book and store it in the repository. Let's write our new book. Our new book will have a title, My Book, will be the Java mindset, and the ISBN of this book will be 0123456789 123. Let's try to store this book in the database. Now the book should be stored, so let's try to assert that everything is fine. We will do multiple assertions, so I will use the assert all to make sure that we do all the assertions, and in case of failure we see all the problems. The first assertion I want to do is to make sure that the UUID was generated and so it's not null. The second assertion we want to do is to make sure that we can load the book from the database. Assertions, assert true, book repository, find by ID, register book ID, get UUID, is present, book not found. Here we are testing that if we try to search for the book using the generated UUID, we will find the book. And that's it for this test. It's a simple test. We could also test that the fields are correct, but let's keep it simple. The second test I want to do is to test sample data here from the data.sql file is loaded. So let's write a test for this too. For this, we will try to load the book with the title Effective Java from the database. So let's use an example for it. This is our book to search for. Let's set the title Effective Java. Now let's create an example of this book. Now let's try to find a book with this title. Here is our candidate. And now let's make sure that we found a book. The true optional book is present. And the second assertion we want to do is to make sure that the author is set, so we know that the data is loaded from the database. And the author of the effective Java is Joshua Bloch. Now we have both tests on place, so let's try them. There is a problem with the SQL script. I haven't specified here the varchar. Let's try the test again. Both tests succeeded, so we can store and load the data from the database, and also we have the sample data. That's it for today.